A lot of people have asked me to describe my thesis topic that I did for graduate school at Rutgers University. And my topic was the selected observations of the Harlem jazz scene. So I'd like to talk about it a little bit for you in this video. At the end of World War I, an estimated 200,000 African Americans and blacks moved to Harlem. And this was known as part of the Great Migration from the South. In the 1920s, Harlem became the cultural center for scholars and intellectuals and artists in African American culture. And therefore, it was known as the Harlem Renaissance in the 1920s. The influx of blacks in Harlem caused the rent to rise dramatically as white people moved out and there was a large influx of people. And that caused the rent prices, for people to just not be affordable to live in single family apartments. So what ended up happening is that many people got together living in apartments. And in order to make the rent, they would do something called rent parties, where they bring together musicians. And that was really the birth of the modern jam session. Pianists such as James P. Johnson, Art Tatum, and Fats Waller were part of this scene that helped develop jazz in the early 20s. The golden age of jazz clubs really arrived in Harlem in the 1920s, really created a new cultural setting for Harlem. You had a lot of major clubs, including the Cotton Club, the Savoy Ballroom, Ed Small's Paradise, Broadway Jones Supper Club, Connie's Inn, and Barron's Exclusive Club. Mobsters, club owners, the vagrants of Harlem, different peoples all came together and rubbed shoulders in these clubs and created a unique cultural setting. In 1929, the stock market crashed, which brought about one of the worst financial crises ever to hit the United States. The wild era of the 1920s came to a close, and the fascination of white people about black people really began to dwindle. African Americans lost their jobs at a much higher rate than whites, and mortgages failed. All sorts of financial problems came about, and this really brought about the race riots, which a lot of people don't know about in Harlem. The Harlem race riots, one of them which was in 1935 and another in 1943, really helped bring about the degradation of the jazz scene in Harlem. Unfortunately, what happened is that racism really took its heel, and a lot of the interracial mixing caused them to close down jazz clubs for long periods of time, which really caused the degradation of what had initially been an amazing scene in Harlem. Something that people don't realize is that there are literally hundreds of clubs in that area at that time, which is just amazing to us now because there's not that many clubs now. Interestingly enough, the swing era came about at the time of the Depression. It was almost like a bounce off from what came about. In the late 30s, the birth of the bebop jam session came about, and there were many players who founded bebop. Some of the spots, Clark Monroe's Uptown House and Minton's Playhouse were some of the breeding ground for these young musicians. Many of these young guys used to hang out at, Dizzy Gillespie's house and learn from him, and this all happened in Harlem. Harlem eventually became a closed place for musicians to perform, and the white audiences really migrated south, downtown, and it changed Harlem, for the foreseeable future. But then in the 50s, the big band scene began to collapse, and the organ scene really came about because it was cheaper. You could have an organ that really represented all those instruments and play with drums and a few instruments and really save money. So you had the organ scene. A few of the main venues during this time was Small's Paradise and Count Basie's, for example. And if you look at my thesis, guys talk about that. I have Alex Layne and Radam Schwartz, for example. As gentrification came about, many of the musicians who had initially lived in Harlem moved to Brooklyn and other outlying areas because it was just too expensive to live in Harlem. The advent of the 1950s brought about new things such as television and radio recordings, which further degraded the fact that people used to go out to clubs and now they weren't. By the 1960s, jazz was virtually nil in Harlem compared to what it had been. With new art forms such as rock and roll, the interest really dwindled. So this is just a brief coverage of some of the Harlem jazz scene. Please check out my thesis. I'll have a link below, and read about the topic. It's really something that was fascinating to me, and I learned so much about Harlem. So I highly recommend you check it out. Thanks for watching. Please subscribe and stay tuned and hit the like button.